Perhaps you are someone who thinks messages addressed to only you are just a technique to make you feel special. Perhaps you assume that when public figures claim to have personal communications, they are speaking to everyone and no one at the same time. You may have never considered that sometimes there is a concept that can only be conveyed to one person at a time, something so specific that it loses its integrity when broadcast to a crowd. This conversation is for you. I want to tell you something I have never articulated publicly before, something I can only say to you directly, because saying it to everyone would dilute its meaning and destroy its power to help the specific person who needs to grasp it right now. This is not about market forecasts or philanthropic announcements or any of the public topics people usually associate with my work. This is about something far more fundamental, a recognition that you are facing a choice at this exact moment that will determine the substance of who you become and the nature of your contribution to the world in the years ahead. Today, I want to share this message because I believe you are the person who needs to hear it. Not because you fit a demographic or a profile, but because the specific constitution of your circumstances has brought you to this dialogue at the precise moment when this insight could alter the trajectory of your entire life. The message I have for you is simple but profound. You are about to abandon an endeavor that matters more than you currently realize. And abandoning it now would be the greatest strategic error of your life. I know this because I can recognize the signs that you probably cannot see in yourself. You have been working towards something important, not necessarily a specific career goal or financial target, but something deeper. A thesis about the world, an ideal you wish to manifest, something that represents who you want to become and what you want your life to signify. But you have been facing obstacles that feel insurmountable, setbacks that seem to indicate your thesis is flawed or that you are not capable of seeing it through, and criticism or indifference from people whose intellectual support you thought you could count on. You have started to question whether your goals were sound, whether you have what it takes to prevail, whether the effort is worth the cost in time, capital, and emotional stress. Most dangerously, you have begun to rationalize surrender, telling yourself that your original aspirations were naive or grandiose, that adapting to more modest expectations is a sign of maturity rather than defeat. You are wrong about all of this, and I need you to understand why before you make a decision you will regret for the rest of your life. The thing you are thinking about giving up on is not just a project, a position, or a dream. It is the part of you that believes you can affect meaningful change, that refuses to accept the conventional limitations others take for granted, that sees possibilities where others see only risks and obstacles. If you abandon this now, you will not just be changing your plans. You will be dismantling the most valuable part of your character, the part that makes you capable of contributions that no one else can make. I have been where you are right now multiple times. There have been moments in my career, whether in challenging a prevailing market consensus or in establishing a new philanthropic institution, when continuing seemed utterly irrational, when the logical choice appeared to be cutting losses and moving on to something more defensible. I recall a time in the mid-1980s when my efforts to support dissidents and foster open inquiry behind the Iron Curtain were facing total collapse. My foundations were a drain on the capital I had generated from my fund, and the project seemed hopeless. An authoritarian regime had cracked down, imprisoning key partners and seizing our materials. I was risking not just a significant portion of my wealth, but my reputation. Friends and financial advisors urged me to stop. They argued I was a fund manager, not a geopolitical strategist, and that I should abandon this philanthropic venture to protect my core business. The logical choice was to accept that I had overextended my reach, to acknowledge that trying to challenge a totalitarian state with philosophical ideas was more than one person could handle. But something inside me refused to accept that logic. Not because I was confident of success, far from it, but because I understood that the idea itself, the principle of an open society, was more important than my personal comfort or financial security. I realized that if this endeavor failed because I gave up, rather than because the forces of oppression were genuinely insurmountable, I would never forgive myself. I would always wonder what might have been possible if I had found a way to persist. More importantly, I understood that the person I would become by retreating would be different from the person I would become by continuing to fight for a principle I held as fundamental, regardless of the outcome. The choice was not truly between success and failure. It was between becoming someone who abandoned his deepest convictions when they became costly, or someone who maintained his values even when doing so required immense sacrifice and uncertainty. That realization changed how I thought about the obstacles we were facing. Instead of seeing the regime's crackdown as evidence that our goals were unrealistic, I began to see it as the price of attempting something meaningful. It was the resistance that proved we were working on something that mattered. This is what I need you to understand about your current situation. The difficulties you are experiencing are not signs that you should give up. They are signs that your work is important enough to be difficult. Trivial ideas do not change the world. Comfortable intellectual challenges do not develop the kind of character that enables extraordinary contributions. The resistance you are facing is not random bad luck. It is the inevitable response of a system to a new, challenging idea. Most people give up at the exact moment when persistence would have made the difference between an ordinary setback and an extraordinary breakthrough. They interpret difficulty as evidence of impossibility, rather than as evidence of significance. But you have the opportunity to be different. You can choose to see your current challenges as the cost of attempting something worthwhile, rather than as reasons to lower your expectations or abandon your goals. The specific thesis you are considering giving up on might seem like just one project among many possible alternatives, but it is not. It is the manifestation of your belief that you can create something of value, that your efforts can make a difference, that the world can be improved through persistent, critical inquiry. If you abandon this belief now, you will find it much harder to access again in the future. You will have taught yourself that when things become genuinely difficult, retreat is the reasonable response. But if you persist through this challenge, you will prove to yourself that you are capable of continuing when continuation seems impossible. You will develop the kind of intellectual resilience and determination that makes future challenges more manageable rather than more intimidating. This is not about blind optimism or refusing to acknowledge real limitations. It is about understanding the difference between obstacles that require new strategies and obstacles that require abandoning worthy goals. Most of the barriers you're facing are solvable if you are willing to approach them with intellectual creativity and persistence. The question is not whether solutions exist, but whether you will continue the work of finding them when that work becomes uncomfortable or uncertain. I am telling you this because I can see something in your situation that you might not be able to see. You are closer to a breakthrough than you realize. The progress you have made, the intellectual frameworks you have built, the understanding you have gained, these represent investments of mind and spirit that will be lost if you give up now, but that will compound rapidly if you continue. The next year of your life will determine whether you become someone who perseveres through significant intellectual and moral challenges, or someone who retreats when persistence becomes difficult. The choice you make will influence not just this particular endeavor, but your approach to every future challenge that requires sustained effort and courage. The people who believe in your ideas are counting on you to prove that the faith they have invested in your potential was justified. But more importantly, the part of yourself that formulated these goals in the first place deserves the chance to see what you are actually capable of when you refuse to accept defeat. That realization, that resistance, is the price of a meaningful endeavor. Changed how I thought about obstacles. But let me tell you about the specific moment when I almost gave up completely, because I think you are in a similar place, and you need to understand what that moment taught me about the difference between temporary defeat and permanent failure. It was a cold night in the winter of 1987. I was sitting alone in my New York office at 11 p.m., staring at a confidential report from Europe. It detailed the complete collapse of our primary network supporting dissidents in a country behind the Iron Curtain. Our main contacts had been arrested. Our channels of support were exposed. Years of work and millions of dollars from my fund had seemingly vanished overnight. The financial press was already portraying my philanthropic work as the naive hobby of a financier. My partners in the fund were becoming openly hostile, suggesting it was time to end this political crusade and focus on our actual business. But the worst part was not the financial pressure or the public criticism. The worst part was the voice in my own head that had started saying, maybe they are right. Maybe you have been fooling yourself about what's possible. Maybe the smart thing to do is admit this experiment has failed and move on. I had reached the point that I think you are at right now, the point where continuing feels like a stubborn denial of an obvious reality, where everyone around you seems wiser and more practical, where your original vision starts to feel naive and embarrassing. That night, I found myself drafting a memorandum to my foundation's board, announcing that we would be terminating our high-risk operations in the region. I actually typed out most of the message, explaining that while we had learned valuable lessons, the insurmountable political realities had proven too difficult to overcome. But before I finalized that memo, I did something that changed everything. I walked to my bookshelf and pulled out my old, heavily marked copy of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. I turned to a passage I had underlined decades earlier, a passage about why the principles of freedom and critical thought must be defended precisely when they are most threatened. Reading those words again, I remembered the clarity and conviction I had felt when I first embraced that philosophy. The problems we were trying to address, dogma, authoritarianism, the closed society, had not become less important because a regime had cracked down on our network. The need for a counter-narrative to totalitarianism had not disappeared because we were losing money and facing criticism. What had changed was not the mission, but my confidence in my ability to accomplish it. I had let a temporary setback convince me that a permanent ideal was unrealistic. As I sat there holding that book, I realized that giving up was not about accepting practical limitations. It was about choosing who I wanted to be, someone who abandoned his deepest philosophical commitments when they became difficult, or someone who continued working for what he believed was important, regardless of how hard it became. I deleted the memorandum announcing our shutdown. Instead, I spent the next 4 hours writing a different message to my team, outlining a new, more resilient, and more creative strategy. I explained why our failures were teaching us what we needed to know, and why our next attempt would succeed because of everything we had learned from this defeat. 2 years later, the Berlin Wall fell. The very movements and individuals we had refused to abandon were at the forefront of building new democratic societies. But the real victory was not the geopolitical outcome or the public vindication. It was the knowledge that I had learned to persist through the kind of profound doubt and intellectual adversity that stops most people from achieving anything extraordinary. This is what I need you to understand about your current situation. You are in your winter of 1987 moment right now. You are facing the choice between the person you become by giving up and the person you become by continuing. The voice telling you to be realistic and practical is not wisdom. It is fear disguised as rationality. The people suggesting you should lower your expectations are not necessarily wrong about the difficulties you face, but they are wrong about what those difficulties mean. Difficulty is not evidence of impossibility. It is evidence that you are working on something that matters enough to be difficult. Easy problems have already been solved. The hard problems are where you have the opportunity to make contributions that no one else can make. Right now, you are probably surrounded by people who think your ideas are unrealistic, who point to your setbacks as evidence that you should adjust your thesis, who suggest that persistence in the face of repeated failure is just a stubborn denial of reality. But those people have never accomplished anything extraordinary themselves. They do not understand that paradigm shifts in thinking always look impossible right up until they become inevitable. They mistake the intellectual resistance that precedes every significant accomplishment for evidence that the accomplishment is impossible. The truth is that you are probably much closer to a breakthrough than anyone around you realizes, including yourself. The intellectual capital you have accrued, the refined thesis, the knowledge gained from testing it, the network you have built, the deep understanding you have acquired through your failures, all of these represent investments that compound rapidly once you achieve momentum. Most people capitulate just before the compound returns from their intellectual investments start to become visible. They interpret the long period of effort without obvious results as evidence that their thesis is flawed, when in fact it is evidence that they are approaching the inflection point where their efforts will start producing exponential rather than linear returns. This is what I need you to do for the next 30 days. Commit to testing your thesis as if retreat were not an option. Do not focus on the ultimate outcome or try to predict its final success. Just focus on the work, on solving the immediate problems, and maintaining forward momentum, regardless of your feelings about the odds. During those 30 days, you will likely discover resources, solutions, and capabilities you did not know you possessed. You will find that many obstacles that seemed insurmountable become manageable when you stop expending energy debating whether to continue and instead focus all of that energy on how to continue. Most importantly, you will remember the fundamental question or problem that started you on this path. You will reconnect with the core insight that motivated you before setbacks and criticism made you question your own judgment. After 30 days of committed effort, without the option of retreat, you will be in a much better position to evaluate your situation objectively and make decisions based on actual evidence, rather than on fear, frustration, or the opinions of people who do not understand what you are trying to accomplish. But I believe that if you give yourself that period of total commitment, you will no longer want to give up. You will have rediscovered the profound satisfaction that comes from engaging with an important problem, and you will have rebuilt the confidence that setbacks had eroded. The message I have for you is this: you are capable of a more rigorous and profound analysis than you currently believe. The work you are doing matters more than current evidence suggests, and giving up now would deprive the world of contributions that only you can make. Do not let temporary difficulties convince you to abandon permanent principles. Do not let the opinions of people who have never challenged an established dogma influence your commitment to goals that represent your deepest values and highest aspirations. You started this work because you believed it was important. That judgment was correct then, and it is correct now. The only thing that has changed is that you have encountered the fierce resistance that always accompanies meaningful intellectual work. Push through that resistance. Trust your original analysis. Give yourself the chance to discover what becomes possible when you refuse to accept defeat. The world needs the questions you are asking. Both I am asking, even if it does not recognize that need yet. But more than that, you need to complete this work to become the person you are capable of being. Do not give up. Not now. Not when you are this close to proving to yourself and to others what persistence makes possible. And remember, the greatest achievements in human history have come from people who refuse to give up precisely when giving up seemed most reasonable. Every person who has ever truly changed the world has faced a moment exactly like the one you are facing now. A moment when persistence seemed foolish, when all evidence suggested retreat, when everyone around them counseled an acceptance of limitations they refused to accept. But here is what I have learned that goes beyond inspirational stories. The moment when giving up seems most rational is often the moment you are closest to a breakthrough. Not because the universe rewards persistence, but because that is the point when you have finally eliminated most of the flawed hypotheses. Every setback has taught you something essential. Every failure has disproven a path you will never have to waste time exploring again. Every person who has told you to lower your expectations has shown you how much resistance your vision generates in minds that have accepted conventional limitations. You are closer than you think. Keep going.